Welcome everyone to our night on sharp-tailed snakes and other reptiles on Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands. My name's Guy Dauncey with the Yellow Point Ecological Society, and I'm going to invite Linda Broymans to introduce you to our two guest speakers. Linda.
Thanks, Guy. My name is Linda Broymans. I'm with the Nanaimo Area Land Trust, and I connected with Carrina and Laura a while back as part of some curiosity of hearing about sharp-tailed snakes that were spotted in our area, specifically in the Yellow Point area. And I was interested to know if they were doing any surveys on private property. And through that, Carrina and Laura agreed very generously to speak to the community, and we're hoping to recruit participants who live in the area where we think there might be sharp-tailed snakes to help us get a better understanding of their distribution. So with that, I'm going to say Carrina is the owner and manager of Maslovat Consulting, a highly successful environmental consulting firm. She's worked as a contractor for over 25 years and has authored over 100 reports and journal articles, including best management practices and management plans for protected areas. She's a botanist and ecologist by training, and since 2018, she has been working with sharp-tailed snakes, doing surveys and developing environmental DNA sampling protocols. Carrina is passionate about ecological restoration and has designed and restored wetlands, forests, coastal sand, and Garry Oak ecosystems to create habitat for species at risk. Laura is a field biologist with over 25 years of experience in the field of wildlife biology, habitat conservation, species at risk monitoring, ecosystem restoration, habitat enhancement, and invasive species management. Focal rare species include birds, plants, reptiles, amphibians, bats, and gastropods. Current research involves development of protocols for novel environmental DNA to detect rare terrestrial species. She's co-authored dozens of reports, including species at risk inventories, land management plans, baseline inventories, and best management practices. Laura has designed and implemented restoration projects for wetlands, forest, coastal sands, and Garry Oak ecosystems to enhance habitat for pollinators, birds, and bats. So thank you both for being here to share your knowledge with us tonight. We're honored to have you as our guests.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda and Guy, for inviting us. And I know both Laura and I are really thrilled to be here. I'm going to apologize up front for my gravelly, sexy voice tonight. I'm just coming off the edge of a chest cold. So I'm going to be drinking tea and sucking lozenges. But if I end up having to leave for a moment to cough, then Laura's going to jump right in and take over for me. So I'm going to start sharing screen, if that's all right.
Yes.
Okay, I need to move you so I can, come on. Oh, come on.
You go back. Do the back arrow.
I'm trying, but it doesn't want to do it. Oh, now it's going forward. There we go. All right, so we're going to talk about sharp-tailed snakes and other reptiles of the Gulf and Vancouver Islands tonight. So we're going to dive in. Most of the talk tonight is going to be about sharp-tailed snakes, which Laura and I have been working on quite closely, and Laura is definitely one of the main experts in the country who's probably seen as many sharp-tailed snakes as anyone else. So we're going to talk mostly about sharp-tailed snakes. But before we do that, I'd like to just kind of give a bit of an overview about some of the other creatures that we have and the other things that we've been finding under our monitoring boards. Probably a big key distinction is just trying to understand the difference between amphibians and reptiles. So snakes, lizards, and turtles are reptiles. They have dry skin and lungs. Some of them lay eggs, and some of them have live young. Whereas amphibians are more closely connected to water. They breathe through their skin and they need to keep their skins moist. Amphibians include salamanders, frogs, and toads. And some of them need water for parts of their life to lay eggs in, and others lay their eggs on the land. So we're going to start with a little quiz. And if folks want to push the thumbs up or the thumbs down arrows, and we can play along in real time. I'm not sure if I can see the results.
So Carrina, yeah, if doing this quiz, what you need to do is show the quiz question and then stop sharing so we can see everyone, and then we can find out whether it's yes or no, whether you get it right. Is that going to work? It means a lot of sharing and stopping sharing, right?
That might be a bit more convoluted than I think we can manage, actually.
Okay, because I can't see everyone's, we've lost everyone's pictures.
Yeah, it'll just be a self quiz.
Okay, then.
And unfortunately, there's no prizes. So yeah, I didn't think about that, but yeah, it's a little easier in a room where you can actually force people to commit and put their hands up. But so this is the first one. So what do people think? Is this a reptile or is this an amphibian? I see some.
We can use the chat. People can put it in the chat for that. Yes.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yes.
So this is an amphibian. It's the northern red-legged frog. And most of our common frogs in the area are Pacific tree frogs, but this is a northern red-legged frog, which is quite rare. It's provincially blue listed, which means it has some level of threat associated with it. And it's federally listed under the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada as special concern. You can identify red-legged frogs by that quite distinctive dorsal ridge along the back. You can see sort of where the eye goes. And if you pick them up on the underside of their legs, they have quite a translucent pinky color. Another really key distinctive feature for northern red-legged frogs is these super long toes in the back, which are quite different from Pacific tree frogs. So this is the time of year right now where northern red-legged frogs are laying their eggs. I have a little pond on my property, and there's a whole, at least 4 different egg masses of northern red-legged frogs. They're about the size of a grapefruit, and they're composed of a bunch of little eggs. And right now, when it's nice and warm or starting to warm up, they're laying their eggs. They're not something that you hear call unless you're really lucky, because they call mostly underwater. So the big, loud, roaring calls in all the wetlands right now, those are Pacific tree frogs, not northern red-legged frogs. So this guy, reptile or amphibian? This is another amphibian. This is our Pacific chorus frog or Pacific tree frog. Now, both the tree frog and the northern red-legged frog, they need wetlands for breeding in, but they also really need the edge habitat. They need the forests next to these wetlands to be able to move up into when they're not breeding. So it's really important for maintaining their habitat that it's not just focused right on the wetland, but it includes all of the adjacent areas. These Pacific chorus frogs have really distinctive toe pads. You can see on these features, they've got these little bulby toes at the ends. So it's a good way to distinguish them. And they're super variable in color, everything from these brilliant green to coppery to kind of browny, tanny colors. So there's a lot of variation in their color. So looking for the toe pads is a good feature to make sure that you know what you're looking at. And if anyone lives near a pond, it's that amazing cacophony right now. It's my favorite thing to fall asleep to the sound of the frogs singing. It's the best. I feel so lucky to have a wetland. So what about this handsome fellow? Reptile or amphibian? This is another amphibian. This is our rough-skinned newt, and it's a type of salamander. And on Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands, we have 6 different species of salamanders: rough-skinned newts, long-toed salamanders, northwestern salamander, western redback salamander, wandering salamander, and ensatina. And half of our salamanders and all of our frogs need water for part of their life cycles, but the reptiles don't. And it's really interesting, the distribution of these species on the different Gulf Islands and Vancouver Island. For example, on Salt Spring, we have long-toed salamander, red-legged frogs, and Pacific tree frogs, but we don't have any of the other salamanders. And it's a completely different suite of species on some of the other Gulf Islands. And so it's a really interesting biogeography question. For example, on Pender, they have rough-skinned newts, but as far as I'm aware and Laura's aware, they haven't seen any of the other salamander species. So it's really interesting to wonder about how these species got to these islands, how long they've been there, and just why they're not on all of the islands. You'd think that if they were on Salt Spring, that it would make sense that they're on Pender as well, but it's not necessarily the case. I should just mention that newts have a super potent neurotoxin that can kill their predators. And so like a lot of salamanders, it's best not to handle them. For newts, it's best not to handle them because you could do damage to yourself. But for a lot of the other salamander species, it's best not to handle them because the oils in your skin can be quite harmful for them unless you know what you're doing. And there's also the possibility of spreading diseases by handling them. So here's an overview of the other salamander species that we have in this area. There's common encetina, which has that, I don't know if you can see, there's a bit of a little notch right at the tail there. So that's a good key diagnostic feature. There's the wandering salamander that has these super cute square toes, like little fluvog shoes. Western redback salamander, which has the browny, reddy back. And then the long-toed salamander, which has this quite yellow stripe down the back. And the northwestern salamander that looks like a squirrel with a couple of pouches full of nuts. It's got the big parotid glands on the side of the face. Now, what about this guy? Is this a reptile? Yes, we're finally into the reptiles. So this is a western painted turtle, which are native to this region. They lay eggs along the shorelines and along the edges of lakes and ponds. Usually in quite a sandy substrate, somewhere where it's loose enough that they can actually dig and be able to get into the substrate. The babies hatch under the sand and then make their way back to the water. And turtles are under a lot of threat for habitat loss and disturbance or predation of their nest sites. And there's also quite a few that get killed while crossing roads. And Linda has been working with Western painted turtles, and I'm super curious to hear more about that at some point. So hopefully I can get caught up and learn more about the work that you're doing with this species. Turtles really love to bask in the sun because they're cold-blooded or poikilothermic. They need to have the sun to be able to regulate their body temperature. So basking sites are super important for turtles to be able to warm up. There's often other exotic turtles that get found in our lakes, red-eared sliders that get released from the pet trades. And releasing pet turtles is really just not a great idea because they can compete with the native turtles and they can also spread diseases, especially when you think of a pet turtle in a small tank that hopefully has its water changed often enough. They just can harbor a lot of diseases. And so releasing them into wetlands is just really harmful for our native turtle species. What about this guy? We're looking at a reptile, amphibian. This is our northern alligator lizard. It's a reptile, not an amphibian, because it's got this leathery, scaly skin. And it's not a snake because it's got legs. And the adults have this really rough, scaly, alligator-y-like skin. And the juveniles are quite tiny, as you can see by that picture on the bottom left there. And they have a real coppery color. They're quite beautiful. They're often, you can see them underneath kind of close to rock piles. They love to be able to skitter underneath rock piles. And they're the only native lizards that we have on Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands. This is one of the introduced species that has really been wreaking havoc. This is the European wall lizard. It was introduced, there were 2 lizards introduced in 1967, and then about 12 that were introduced in 1970. They were from a zoo in Saanich. They were originally from Italy, and they have been slowly and steadily spreading like crazy. They were recently recorded from Salt Spring Island, which is really disappointing. They're known from North Pender now. And they can spread up to about 100 meters a year on their own, but they'll also move around in piles of lumber or in plants that are being moved around. And so they're really starting to be a big problem. They're in quite a few of the parks in Saanich, all the way out to Mill Hill and Langford. And I don't know if you have any up in the Nanaimo, Cedar, Yellow Point area yet, but hopefully not yet. It's a really good thing to keep an eye out for. They're kind of, they've got a lot more speckly coloration and a brighter green than the alligator lizard. So if you do see one, it would be really helpful to try and get a picture of them. There's Gavin Henke at the Royal BC Museum is trying to keep track of this species. He's also been working on doing some prey analysis to try and figure out what they're eating, because there's so many of them and they're spreading so quickly that they must be having an impact, not just on the reptiles that they're competing with, but also on the invertebrate populations.
So Carrina, we got word in the chat that there are lots in Nanaimo. There
are lots in Nanaimo already. Yeah. Oh, that's too bad. Yeah, it's really, they're moving quickly, and that's unfortunate, because I'm not sure how to put the genie back in the bottle with that one. It's a pretty tricky thing to try to control. So what about this handsome fella? Reptile? Yeah. This is one of our 3 species of garter snakes. So we have 3 different species, and they're all relatively similar and incredibly tricky to tell apart. So we know that it's a reptile because it's scaly, and it's a snake, so it doesn't have legs, doesn't need water for part of its life cycle. And garter snakes in this area can get to be up to 1 meter long. I've never seen one quite that big, but some of them can be pretty impressive. So all of our garter snakes have live young, which is really interesting. Other than the sharp-tailed snake, which lay eggs, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But all 3 species of garter snake give birth to live young. So this is the northwestern garter snake. It's really, really super variable in color. Most of them have a yellow stripe down the back and side stripes on the side that are yellowish. Some of them are reddish. Some of them have no stripes. Some of them are completely melanistic and are all black. So one of the definitive ways to tell which species you're looking at is to count the upper labials, which are these scales right here. So you need to be pretty up close and personal to be able to identify this species for sure. So having a good count of this upper lip. And then there's also key characteristics that have to do with the scales on the back pattern too. So if you really want to geek out about garter snakes, you do need to get up quite close to them and get a pretty good look at them. So here's some more northwestern garter snakes that just shows the variation in the color. That one at the top that's quite dark. This really lovely reddish and brown one on the bottom here, which is I think can be quite easily confused with sharp-tailed snakes, which are the focus of our talk tonight. And so mating for all of these garter snakes takes place in the spring, although some of them mate in the fall, and they all give birth to live young between 2 and 24 babies. This is our second species of garter snake. This is the western terrestrial. Generally, they have this kind of broken line on the back, more of a kind of a diamond back pattern. They have a different number of these upper scales. They have 8, whereas the northwestern has 7. They can often be found near water, either fresh or marine, but that's just sort of a general a general guideline. And then the third species that we have is the common garter snake, which generally has a really distinctive, well-defined stripe down the back. Sometimes the stripes are yellow or greenish, and it's often near water as well. And it's kind of this striking yellow-green stripes on this black, kind of like racing stripes. What about this one? Is this reptile? No, that's my joke. Definitely not a reptile. What about these guys? So these are our focus. These are our babies. These are the snakes that Laura and I get really excited about. These are the sharp-tailed snakes. So they are listed as threatened by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. They are provincially on the red list, which means that they're at risk. Well, they're at risk for a number of different reasons. They're really small, as you can tell by that photo on the bottom. And this is a little hatchling, which is they're brighter red in color than the adults. They spend most of their time underneath the ground, and they're often in loose woody debris or rocky talus slopes. And because they spend so much of their lives underneath the ground, they can be really challenging to find, and they can be really challenging to know anything about. So as I mentioned before, they lay eggs, and so therefore their habitat is a lot more limited than the garter snakes. They are found in kind of south or southwest facing slopes that warm up. And we know really very little about them. Eggs have only been found in the wild for the species once. There was a hibernaculum that was found in 1969 in Oregon with a whole bunch of other species. I think there were 5 or 6 other snake species. And that's the only time that eggs have ever been seen in the wild for this species, which is kind of amazing to me that our technology is so advanced, and yet we know so little about a species that we share space with every day. So the key diagnostic features for knowing if you have a sharp-tailed snake is the tail. They have this kind of thorn-like tip of their tail. Garter snakes have a pointy tip, but it's a lot more elongated, so a longer triangle, whereas the sharp-tailed is kind of blunt. They have this really distinct barring on the underside on the belly, and they're really, really smooth if you pick them up. All the garter snakes have keels on their scales, so when you pick them up, they feel rough, but a sharp-tailed snake, when you pick it up, it just feels smooth and kind of not really slippery, but just really smooth. And as I mentioned, they live in Garryoke ecosystems and open Douglas fir forest on these southwest facing slopes. They need places where there's quite a lot of openness so that they can warm up, but then they also can move into the edges of the forest at different times of the year. So the Garryoke ecosystems, as probably most of you know, are having a really hard time. There's less than 5% that remains, and even that 5% that does remain has been severely impacted by invasive species, through fire suppression, through and then there's trails and recreational impacts, which have all kind of exploded, especially with the recent pandemic and people rediscovering their love for outdoors. So these little pockets and postage stamps that remain are really critical and really important habitat for a whole range of over 100 different rare species, including the sharp-tailed snake. So here's the distribution of sharp-tailed snake. You can see we're up here on southeastern Vancouver Island, and then they're found through Oregon, Washington, and the main central part of their range is down in California. And here's the distribution on the right in BC. You can see there's this one isolated dot way up here in Pemberton, which is a relatively new population. And it was just 2 years ago decided that this is its own distinct population, separate from these ones on Vancouver Island. So this is kind of the core of the range in Canada, is southeastern Vancouver Island and some of the Gulf Islands. And it's just recently been discovered up in your neck of the woods, up around Cedar, Yellow Point, Ladysmith area. So it's a huge range expansion to have found this new site for sharp-tailed snakes. It's about 100 kilometers further than where we knew they had been before. So it's kind of an exciting find to know that they have a wider distribution than they do. So what do we know about sharp-tailed snakes? As I mentioned, surprisingly little, shockingly little. We don't know the eggs. We don't know much about, you know, how many young they have. But we do know that each snake has a really distinctive throat pattern. You can see those photos on the right-hand side by looking at these chin pictures. Some of them have no dots, some of them have small dots, some of them have larger dots, and it's almost like a thumbprint. And so when we are out doing surveys for sharp-tailed snakes, we take the pictures of these throat patterns, and that helps us know if we've collected the same snake before. So we can get some really interesting information if we can recapture a snake. They also have really distinctive markings on the underside of their tails. Some of them are quite pink, some of them are white, some of them have, you know, sort of a pink stripe on a white background. And so by collecting all of this information, the weight, the length, these distinctive features, we can be pretty certain when we recapture a snake again. And because so little is known about the biology of these species, every little bit of information that we can collect is really super important. For example, last year we recaptured a snake that we had captured almost 4 years prior, and it had only grown 2 centimeters and it had increased in weight by 0.5 gram. So these snakes aren't very big, and previously it was thought that they lived about 10 years, but I think that Laura and I are fairly convinced that they probably live a lot longer than 10 years just because they grow so slowly. So we have no idea if the snakes that we're catching, how old they are or how long they've been in the same place, but just getting a little bit of an understanding of how slowly they grow is really important information. So the way that we survey for sharp-tailed snakes is using artificial cover objects, which is a really fancy, glamorous name for a chunk of asphalt shingle, which is about, I guess they're about 1 foot by 1 foot, 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. It's just cut from a roll of roofing shingles. We place them in areas where there's good habitat for sharp-tailed snake, such as this loose woody debris from an old rotting stump, or these rocky talus slopes that are loose. Because they spend so much of their time under the ground, they really need spaces to be able to move underneath. So that's why this loose wood and this loose rock is really important for them. They wouldn't be able to get in through the ground in a lot of places. So we set up the ACOs, the artificial cover objects, and then in the spring and the fall, we like to be able to go out above 10 degrees, and then the boards are warming up and the snakes will move up underneath the boards just to be able to get a little bit warmer, because the black asphalt heats up more than the surrounding areas. So the snakes just move up underneath the boards, and then we can lift the board and not have to pull apart all their rocks and all the wood to be able to find them. So we don't have to destroy their house in the process of looking for them. So it's a really, it can be quite time consuming, but it's a really good non-invasive way of being able to survey for this species. In some cases, it's taken up to 8 years to find a snake in some locations, even with fairly consistent monitoring. So it is definitely an exercise in patience to be able to monitor for these species. So because it's so involved and so time consuming, one of the things that Laura and I have been working on is using environmental DNA to try to detect this species. So environmental DNA is basically just anything that is left behind from a species. So if they if they poop, if they lose scales, all of that has genetic material in it. It's been used quite a bit for aquatic sampling. There's been some really interesting work in wetlands and lakes to be able to pick up amphibians. And it kind of makes sense because amphibians spend, I mean, take for example, a red-legged frog, which spends all of its life in a wetland. It's laying its eggs, the egg cases are sloughing off, it's losing skin cells, it's defecating in the wetland. It makes sense that you would be able to pick up DNA from that. But then there's also been work with species that are in rivers and riparian areas that are flowing, and eDNA has successfully been able to be picked up from that too. So we hatched this scheme that, well, maybe we can pick up eDNA from sharp-tailed snakes. There hasn't been very much done on terrestrial eDNA, but we approached Karen Helbing at the University of Victoria lab and had some great conversations with her and said, what do you think? Is this a possibility? And had them come out in the field with us and started exploring the possibility of whether we could actually pick up DNA from places. So we started out by collecting a swab using a cotton finger caught on the underneath of the artificial cover object, and also collecting soil samples. So doing this when we found a snake to say, like, is this even possible? Can we pick this up when we see a snake? And the nice thing about using an artificial cover object is because it is protected from the sun, and so it prevents the UV light from hitting both the soil sample and the underside of the object, which then stops the DNA from degrading because it gets really easily broken down in the sunlight. So then we started taking a whole bunch of eDNA samples. We took them whenever we found a snake. We took them where we didn't see snakes. So we would use the same artificial cover objects that we had set out, and in places where we had never seen a snake before, we started taking these samples. And we also tried taking some samples with natural cover objects, so rocks and bark and things that snakes would normally use without the cover objects to be able to move under and thermoregulate. And I think we were both pretty surprised that it actually worked. So we were able to pick up the DNA from both the soil samples and the artificial cover objects where we had snakes in our hand and we knew that they were there. Not consistently, not 100% of the time, but enough to be quite encouraged by the results. And we were also able to pick up eDNA when we hadn't actually visually seen a snake. And for the first time this year, we were able to pick up a whole new occurrence at a site where we've never seen a snake, but we had such a strong positive result from one of the cover objects that we know that they're there. So it's a really exciting complementary tool that we can use when we're out surveying for sharp-tailed snakes. And we also had some suspected positive results from natural cover objects. But it's a bit of a needle in a haystack to try and figure out which natural cover object to swab. But it was exciting to even be able to pick up some DNA from those natural cover objects. We still have tons of questions. We don't know how long the eDNA persists. We don't really know the best time of year for doing eDNA surveys. We don't know what makes it decay and how long it takes to decay. And we're still not really sure why sometimes when we actually have a snake in our hand, we're not picking up the DNA. It could be because we're just not scooping the right place for soil. It could be that the snake's curled up in a ball and doesn't have contact with the cover object. So there's still a lot that we're sort of trying to fine tune with this, but it's really exciting that we've had such positive results. So for folks that are out there that are as excited about snakes as Laura and I are, or even on the spectrum of being excited about sharp-tailed snakes, there's lots that folks can do to be able to help them. It's great to be able to just know that they're out there and keep your eyes open for them. With this recent range expansion, it's pretty exciting that there's a lot more possibilities of where these species might occur. And then there's some other ideas here. I'll go over these in a bit more detail as we go through the next slides. But limiting mowing and brush clearing is also really helpful. Planting native plants, controlling invasive species, maintaining rocks and woody debris for habitat, sharing data, and helping with monitoring. So I'll go through each of those suggestions in a bit more details as we go through. So it can be really harmful for a lot of snakes, not just sharp-tailed snakes, to be mowing. Ideally, if you have a lawn that you need to mow, if you let it get really long and shaggy, it's best to walk through it first before mowing it, just to scare whatever snakes are in the grass. Either that or keep it cut regularly enough that it stays short. So it's sort of that, or not cut it at all, and then you have a perfect excuse if your neighbors complain that you're trying to maintain the habitat. Leaving leaf piles is also great, just to be able to provide habitat, and it's also good for places where the prey can live. Planting native plants in areas that need restoration is a really great way to help a whole bunch of species. Planting native plants helps for provide food for pollinators, and in turn, because you're increasing the insect diversity, it also creates habitat for aerial insectivores, so things like barn swallows and olive-sided flycatchers that need insects. And it also provides habitat for prey items for sharp-tailed snakes. Keeping on top of invasive species removal, it's kind of a constant challenge in this area because of Scotch broom, which can be incredibly dense in some areas. And once Scotch broom really becomes established, it can really shade out those warm, sunny slopes that the snakes need to be able to lay their eggs and thermoregulate. So keeping these open sunny Garry oak and open Douglas fir areas free from Scotch broom is super helpful for maintaining the habitat for sharp-tailed snakes. And because snakes need these loose rock piles and woody debris, just leaving those be, keeping invasive species out of them, but not trying to clean up too much in your yards, and keeping rock piles and keeping woody debris is also really important for maintaining habitat. And if you do happen to find a snake, it's really great if you can document it. Photos are really important because it can be possible to get them confused with other species. And if you do share your data, then it can help protect not just sharp-tailed snakes, but also a whole range of other species that are found in Garry oak ecosystems. So as I mentioned before, there's about 100 different rare species that are found in these Garry oak ecosystems. And by protecting and maintaining the habitat for sharp-tailed snakes, it can also help support all these other species. Sharing data about where sharp-tailed snakes occur can help with recovery planning. So for both the provincial and the federal government to understand how many of these populations there are, how widespread they are, is really important information. And because we know so little about these snakes, every little bit of information is really, really important. And so by protecting habitat in one area can also help protect habitat on neighboring properties as well. And sharing information can also help inspire stewardship. I'm going to share a story about a little sharp-tailed snake that was found on southern Salt Spring Island. There was a landowner who had a robin nest on their deck, and the baby robin had fallen out of the nest, which is very sad. And the parents were trying to feed it, and they brought a sharp-tailed snake and were trying to feed it to this little robin, who was absolutely horrified and had no idea what to do with this thing. I don't know if you can see the scratch marks on the back of this sharp-tailed snake on this photo on the right, but luckily the story has a happy ending, because the landowners, they took the robin and they put the robin back in the nest, and they took the sharp-tailed snake and got a great picture of it. and then they put it back in some loose debris. But it's such a strange story, but it's really provides some interesting insights in that, okay, now we know that actually birds can move this species around, and that might be part of the puzzle of why these snakes are on some islands and not on some islands, and how did they get to Salt Spring in the first place from Vancouver Island? How did they get to Vancouver Island from California? You know, so it might be part of that puzzle. And it's also just a really interesting, weird story. And luckily these landowners were very enthusiastic and willing to share their data. And so that data is now being shared with the Conservation Data Center and can be used for recovery planning. For folks that are interested in sharing sightings, iNaturalist is a really great way of making information public. And then that information can be made accessible for recovery planning. And it's an interesting, outside of sharp-tailed snakes, it's a good way to sort of understand a little bit more of what's in our region. And there's some really incredible experts that put a lot of time into iNaturalist and can help with identification of things as well. And if there's anyone that happens to have the right kind of habitat at their place, either open Douglas fir ecosystems, Gary Oak meadows, especially anywhere where there's loose rock piles or woody debris, that might be interested in working with NALT to help monitor for snakes, then that would be fantastic. We will connect with Linda through that, and because we're really interested in learning more and just trying to get a better handle on the whole distribution of these snakes in Canada. And I just want to say a big thank you to all of the agencies and grant people that have supported this work. It's been quite an amazing collaborative effort with a lot of different folks pitching in and helping. And that's a little bit more of a plug that if folks are interested in helping monitor for sharp-tailed snake, it also helps support our work because we can use the volunteer time to help leverage more grant funding to be able to pay for eDNA analysis and all of that kind of thing that helps support this work. And I just want to say thanks to everyone for actually choosing to be inside on the first sunny evening it feels like we've had in ages and spend time to learn about sharp-tailed snakes. So thanks so much to everyone for taking the time tonight.
That's fabulous.
And I didn't see anything in the chat room, so
there's lots that's accumulated in the chat.
Yeah.
Linda, back to you.
Do you want me to share what's in the chat?
We'll be going to go straight on to
or the stewardship.
The stewardship. You want to go straight on, or do you want to have do you want questions first?
Okay, well, I guess maybe I can talk a little bit about the idea that I hatched with Carrina and Laura. I think there's already surveys that are happening at Woodley Range, which is provincially run, and those surveys are conducted by provincial biologists or hired through the province. But I think that properties that are in the Yellow Point area that fit those habitat checks that Carrina mentioned, you know, if anyone has any habitat like that and they're willing to host some artificial cover objects on their property, it's really as simple as putting those shingles and then learning from Carrina how to check them once in a while and see if there's a snake under there, and that can provide really valuable data. So if there are people who are interested, or if you have neighbors, maybe your property doesn't fit the bill, but your neighbors do, or something like that, then please connect with me. My email is, should I put it in the chat?
Yeah.
stewardship@nalt.bc.ca, or talk with Guy. I mean, this is just going to be an ongoing sort of evolving process, I think, as we figure out how we can do this work together with the community, because really the community is the most important part about this, because it has to be on people's property. So
Linnea has a question. Linnea, do you want to unmute yourself and unmute your camera and do your question live?
Oh yes, okay, thank you. This is my first. Hi there, thank you very much. Just I really want to learn a lot more about reptiles in particular, because I know that just habitat destruction and lack of sampling and observing is just part of their challenge, the challenges amongst other things. But just a question about like the photographs that have them handling the snake. I know, like, are they because they're cooler, or is like, if is that you don't want to be encouraging people to handle snakes probably, but is that from your sampling, and they're relatively inactive because of temperature and they're mellow, and just some comments on that would be helpful, please.
Thanks. Carrina or Linda?
Yeah, that is those photos I took, and they are usually of me handling them. And I do have a wildlife permit and a SARA permit and all the permitting in place to handle these species during our project. So you're right. It is really good to be careful about that. And we're not encouraging people to handle them, but if you do decide that you want to monitor for these snakes on your property because you have suitable habitat, the best thing to do is to always have a camera or a phone in hand so you can get a photo. That's the most important thing to do, is to just get a photograph that somebody can verify, and that will help us all to know whether it's a sharp-tailed snake or not, because sometimes the baby garter snakes can be just as small and very confusing to identify. And so a photograph is a perfect way to not disturb them, but to just get a quick photo for identification.
Are they fast movers once you remove the cover object?
They are much slower and much sweeter and more docile. And so they are a little bit more like behaviorally different than a garter snake or an alligator lizard. And those tend to like skitter away very quickly and have much more skittish movements. So that this is also kind of another telltale sign is somebody mentioned in the chat box, like, are they sitting still and coiled up sometimes? And sometimes garters will do that too, but almost always sharp-tailed snakes are quite docile and slow and curled up in a little ball. And when they're sort of coiled up, they can be, the size of a quarter or a loonie, as you could see from some of the pictures. So they're quite tiny and yeah, very sweet.
Yeah, my local contact who had one on his property that sort of spurred this whole thing on for me, he said he thought it was a worm. He thought it was a really big, weird looking worm, because he must have seen the underside and it was just like, what is this thing?
Yeah, they do. They're almost the size of some of the big, or the fat earthworms you get. Then they're sort of coiled up like that, and they have that sort of pinkish, browny pink hue. So they can be mistaken for sure.
I have a question about garter snake. On Ruxton Island, we have a property, and we see them regularly going into the salt water, into the bay, and catching small fish. Is that something new? Because we had a place there for about 45 years, and I haven't noticed it before until the last, say, 5 or 6 years.
Laura or Linda or Carrina?
I don't know if that's new or not. The Thamnophis totalis, the one type of garter snake, is more aquatic, and they will be in wetlands. Or were you saying that you saw it in salt water?
In salt water, in the bay on a regular basis. Yeah.
That's it. That's really interesting. Yeah, there are more in freshwaters that I know of, but that's an interesting observation.
And actually catching small fish. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's cool.
They're big ones, big snakes.
Thank you for sharing that.
So there's been a question like, what do they eat? Which I'm curious about too.
Well, the sharp-tailed snakes mainly eat native slugs. So, there's a lot of different invasive slugs that we have in our neighborhoods these days, in our gardens. We've all probably seen a lot of different ones, the big brown ones, the big black ones, some little garden slugs, but we have a lot of some very small native slugs as well that are kind of like the sharp-tailed snake, more cryptic, harder to find, hiding in forests or forest edges, and often underneath things. So usually we've learned from other colleagues doing other research on sharp-tailed snakes that we were learning more that they're active at night a lot, which makes more sense knowing that they eat slugs a lot, which also come out at night and eat all of our garden little veggies and things like that, and forest plants. And so the snakes are more active at night to eat those slugs. And we have also found them eating worms. So they've been noted to eat a few other things. But as Carrina mentioned in the presentation, we're collecting little fecal samples. And so you can do genetic work on their poop and find out what they're eating. And that'll give us a bit more information in the long run. But mostly it's slugs and worms and other sort of soft-bodied animals and insects.
Sharon's asking, do they have times of day when they're more active? You kind of answered that. And are there any temperature preferences? And I want to answer that, like, do they hibernate in the winter?
Well, we don't know a ton, but yes, it's likely that they have some seasonal movements in and out of these sort of open, sunny habitats where they spend most of their sort of spring and fall active periods when we find them more under these boards. So they're coming out to probably mate and lay their eggs. And because they lay eggs, they need to stay in a warm environment until they hatch. And so these southwest facing beautiful Garry Oak meadows that we all love to live in are great for snakes that maybe want to lay eggs to keep them warm as well. And so yeah, they are a little bit more active for us to find them in the spring and fall. So now is a great time. We're finding snakes on our surveys, and usually we find them in the fall. The last couple of falls, we've had these extended droughts and summer heat domes and very dry seasonal weather. And we've seen very low active levels of snakes. And it may be that they're coming out more at night and not coming out at all in the hot, dry weather, or moving slightly into the forested areas to find food, or staying more underground to stay cooler. So climate shifting is also impacting species like this and their activity behaviors.
So Julie Devereux is asking, is much known about how many eggs are laid or how long they take to hatch?
No, there's very little known. There's been a few captive snakes, I think, over the years, but we know very little. I think it was like 1 to 5 or 6, kind of, it's a variable kind of number. So you may find up to 5 or 6 if you found them, but only one's been found ever. And so very, very little knowledge is known about that.
So if you have questions, put them in the chat and we can pass them on. And so another question that comes to my mind is, if you, as it were, suddenly find them in Yellow Point, is it more likely that they've always been here, but no one ever found them before? Because I hardly see them commuting over the Malahats at the speed you're talking about, right?
It's true. Yeah. Their distribution would be very slow. And there is a historic record in the Cowichan district. It's very vague. There's not a precise location. And so there are these hints that maybe somebody has seen them before in other places. And so it's likely that they've been there for a while, and even when they're right in front of you, so to speak, like Carrina was saying, there are places where like, this is great habitat, let's look for them. And 8 years later, we finally found one under one of our boards. And so they're really tricky to find, and they could very well be in some of these places, but you've just never seen them, or we've never seen them at the right time, or somebody saw one and wasn't sure what it was. And so, yeah, it's definitely worth looking and keeping your eyes out for them.
So Julie's wondering whether Notch Hill in the Noose.
Yeah, it could very well. That's great habitat potential. There's no reason why they couldn't be there. It's just a matter of taking time to look for them for a while. And we have had some folks looking in different areas up the island, but it takes a lot of time and consistency for sure. And because these snakes are sort of at the north end of their range in North America, as we know, when species kind of reach the edge of their range limits, they get, there's fewer and fewer of them. And so they may be, we don't know exactly where that northern limit is. And so there could be small populations, and then we just don't know where that cuts off, right? So looking for them is important.
Wendy's asking if there's any First Nations knowledge about them, or Indigenous knowledge,
Yeah, I have never heard of that knowledge specifically in reference to this species yet. Mm. I wouldn't be surprised if there might be some, but I haven't personally connected with anybody about that.
Yeah. And so Pamela's asking, how often do you check the sites?
Well, it depends on how much time you have on your hands, but you can check sites, ideally 3 to 5 times in the spring and 3 to 5 times in the fall. I honestly don't think checking a site too often is a problem. They're either going to use the board to warm up or not if they're there. And other species will come under the boards. We have lots of garter snakes, alligator lizards, frogs, salamander sometimes under there. So it's kind of cool to just see what other critters you have in your backyard that use these things. But if you do end up checking the sites, if you want to have some snake boards installed at your home or somewhere like that, usually it's about 3 to 5 or 6 times in the spring and the fall where they're more active.
And because other people will watch this video in the recording form, you could get people on Salt Spring or Alternate Place. If someone says, yes, I'd like a board, can you talk us through the process of actually looking at it? You take a camera with you, just open it and watch, or what's the ideal observation when you lift up the board?
Yeah, having a camera is the main thing. I mean, Carrina and I, in our work, collect a lot of other data because we're doing sort of long-term recaptures of different snakes to get more information about their life history and how fast they're growing. But that kind of data is not something that everyone needs to collect. So right now, the most important thing for landowners is to get a photo so that we just have a sense of where they're distributed across our communities. And that really helps. And so, yeah, just opening the board up and having your camera ready, because sometimes there's other snakes under there and they'll skitter away really quick, but it's nice to know and get a photo of anything really, and we can help you identify them. But often, almost 100% of the time, if there's a sharp-tailed snake under your board, it's curled up in a little tiny circle. It looks like an earthworm. It's kind of pinky brown, and it's sitting there just zenning out on the heat of the board, and it's not going to scoot away really quickly. And you have time to okay, get my phone, go. But just take the photo as quick as you can, and that would help really to identify them.
Is there an optimal time of day to check the board?
We tend to try to check them at all different times. Usually a little bit later in the day tends to probably be better because the boards have had time to warm up. Although we've also found them like right before dusk because they're about to be active, that they're, and they've maybe been under a board all day or all afternoon in the sun. We also have found them first thing in the morning. So, if you have time to do it when the boards are warm and there's some direct sunlight on them in the later part of the day is probably the best.
So Julie Devereux's got her predator hat on, and she's wondering if a garter snake would eat a sharp-tailed snake.
It very well could happen. I don't know for certain. I've never heard it officially, but for sure a sharp-tailed snake could be eaten by, I think, a garter snake. It's definitely possible.
And would it be right?
However, I will caveat that with, I have found them coiled up beside each other under the boards together, perfectly, seemingly amicable, and maybe they're both full and have just had their own meals and they're fine. So,
but for purposes of genetic diversity, would it make intuitive sense that if you find one snake, there may be 5 or 10 in that vicinity? They've got to breathe, and they've got to breathe with themselves.
Yeah, with that is the case. And we have very small little areas sometimes where we've been doing research, and we'll find the same ones over and over. And sometimes some of them look very similar and have a very similar throat pattern. So they're probably brother and sister or related in some way, or maybe came out of the same clutch of snakes. And so this is another part of the interesting sort of genetic work that we're collecting swabs from each snake that we find, that the province is working on to try to work on that a little bit more to get more information. But yeah, there are, and because they don't move very far, they're just, they have very small ranges. It's just recently been found that one has moved almost up to 200 meters from some other colleagues. And we found the same snake 6 years later under the exact same board in the same spot. And so they're moving seasonally a little bit out of the hot, sunny spots into the adjacent forest, but they're not going far. They're not going over the Malahat for sure.
Carrina, you probably accumulated some other thoughts to share in the last 20 minutes.
Well, it's great to be able to let Laura field the questions, because she's been looking at this species for 25 years, and I'm a botanist by training, so I'm fairly late to the snake game. So I definitely defer to Laura on all things snake. So yeah, no, it's a real privilege to get to see them anytime. It's a real luxury. So I don't have too much to add. No thanks, though.
That's okay. Linda, you're going to be our point person for the pointy-tailed, right? in the whole Nanaimo Ladysmith Yellow Point area.
Yeah, for this area.
So if people
just to not overburden them with people showing photos of garter snakes and asking if they're sharp-tailed. No, I'm just kidding, but. So I did peruse the Field Naturalist of Vancouver Island Facebook page, and I looked up sharp-tailed snake, and almost every instance, if it wasn't in Souk, it was like a garter snake that someone thought was a sharp-tailed snake. There were also instances of people, just speaking of other reptiles, when they see the melanistic garter snake, where people are really scared that it's a non-native snake that's been released, and some people even in these posts have like captured the snake to know, what do I do if it's not a native snake? So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that at all.
I think, again, getting a photograph is the best thing. There are a lot of amazing talented people who can identify all kinds of things. Carrina mentioned iNaturalist. that is one way. You could post anything there and people will help you verify what it is. And there are folks at the museum, the Royal BC Museum, that are also great at figuring things out. There's been a few cases where random strange snakes that shouldn't be where they are have had photographs taken of them, and lots of discussion ensues. But a picture is the best way to help solve a puzzle, and rather than handling something that may well be just naturally there on its own and going on its own way.
Mm-hmm.
So Linda, if people on this call or listening to the video think they have a suitable location, which is ideally a sunny exposed Garry Oak meadow or a mossy bluff or a south facing or even place, and they want to have a board, what's the process for getting a board, and does it come with a set of written instructions?
So they'll email me and I'll connect with Carrina and Laura to either source the material directly from them or to be directed how to make them. I mean, yeah, we can sort that out. And then I think that the observations and that will go to me and through me to them, just so that the data will all be in one place for them to easily look at it whatever point in time is convenient to them. But if we do find sharp-tailed snakes, I'm sure there will be lots of emails.
Yeah,
lots of excitement.
I'm happy to, if people send you photos and you aren't able to tell what they are, I get people sending me absolutely interesting photos all the time. What is this? So
yeah,
I'm happy to do that. If there's
so also
there was I did want to say one thing, and I wanted your feedback on this, Laura and Carrina. I think there is a little bit of concern that if there is one particular site in our area that people know there are sharp-tailed snakes, that it'll be more heavily frequented for people trying to see them. And so that is, I guess, one issue that we need to figure out.
So we could establish a protocol that when you're telling people that you found one, you do not say where it is, and except privately to you. You do not post it on Facebook where it is and stuff like that. Because you don't want people traipsing in. It's like, if it's like the bird watchers, they can get pretty keen, right?
I think it's unlikely that people would come onto private property to come to look for a sharp-tailed snake, would be my gut feeling. That I think there aren't enough other sites that have been posted on iNaturalist, and if folks are really keen, I mean, the chances of seeing them, I mean, even when we're out looking for them with a concerted effort, we see them so infrequently that I think it's probably unlikely, especially on private property, that would be of concern, that if you found one that you would be swarmed. It's a different group of folks, snake people than bird people.
Denise says that we should be able to get a couple of asphalt shingles for free at any lumber store, Rona, Home Depot, Lowe's, and etc. And then Pamela's saying she's got a bunch of them, happy to give them away. Pamela, where do you live, and can you get them to Linda, or what's the best way to do this? Pamela,
so are they really just shingles for Carrina?
Well, the type we use, I mean, it's really anything that's kind of like in that ballpark that is usually dark gray or black that warms up, and like Carrina says, 30 or 40 centimeters squared. You can have a smaller piece too, but just using those kind of things helps to like warm the ground up. And so as long as it's sort of a darker material, that is helpful. And I do have extra stuff too, so if there were landowners that were interested and you didn't have any, then we can try to sort that out. And
would you place it on on top of some broken down wood or rocky stuff and not on top of a bunch of grasses, for instance.
Yeah, that's right. Usually if you had a log that had fallen over and was really rotting into the ground and quite decomposed, you could put it right on top where the wood is already very well decayed. If it was a smaller piece, you could put it right beside it, but usually right on top often works, or on top of talus or loose piles of rocks, that type of thing. Yeah. Okay. Or right adjacent to it.
And I could bring them to the Yellow Point Ecological Society AGM, and if anybody wanted to pick them up there, they could.
Yeah, so you bring them. We're having our AGM on April the 22nd, Saturday, April 22nd at 5 o'clock at our home on Barney Road. So yeah, come along and we'll give you a shingle if you want a place to put it. That's great. One other question: if someone thinks that there's a really good site in a local, regional or provincial park, are there any protocols, or do they just quietly put it in there?
Yeah, somebody noticed that you also mentioned you should place a rock on top of it, which is a great idea. We usually do that as well because they can blow away in the wind or shift. And and yes, regarding public spaces like parks and protected areas, there are a vast multitude of paperwork to go through in order to do that. So no, do not just go place it in there. There are huge protocols and permitting and all kinds of things that need to be in place. So I don't advise you to willy-nilly post them in protected areas, only because there is a process and everybody's has different jurisdictions about that.
So Hallie Swift is saying that the regular 3-tab shingles have tar on the back designed to get sticky when it's heated by the sun.
Yeah, I don't advise using the torch on type stuff that's got the sticky stuff. Yeah.
Just the old-fashioned asphalt shingles that we're not supposed to use on our roofs anymore, right?
It's harder to find. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone? Just jump in, unmute yourself and feel free to go for it. And we'll be wrapping up soon.
I would just suggest that if anybody's interested, if landowners are interested, to connect with Linda, and she can connect with us if anyone has any questions or thoughts about it further, and we can try to coordinate and help folks answer any questions. And yeah.
So Pamela's saying, if you do have those sticky kind, can you either put them upside down or put two together? And then Sharon's asking, what about fiberglass shingles? Do they work?
I have not used fiberglass shingles. I think I would say probably just avoid the ones that get hot and sticky, because other things can get in between them. And if they melt,
they'll get stuck.
They might. It's unlikely, but other things will get stuck. You know, if there's other debris and leaves and that kind of stuff, it will stick to that. So
all righty. Anything else we need to know? We want to get 20 people in the Yellow Point Cedar area all saying yes, let's try it. All that you're asking really is that, you know, we try and put it in a likely area, then check it 5 times a year. It's not exactly burdensome, and it's the fun of excitement. It's like scratching a lottery ticket, right?
I've been doing this for 25 years or more, and every time it's like opening a stocking at Christmas or like an Easter egg scavenger hunt. It's when you find them, it's so spectacular, and they're such sweet little critters. And yeah, it's really amazing. And learning more and having other landowners and people looking for them, it has really helped. We've had so many other folks on some of the Gulf Islands over the years doing the same thing, and it's really increased our knowledge about them and the distribution. And this would be really great. And so connecting with Linda at NALT if you want some shingles, and Pamela, who offered to help them, maybe we can coordinate there so that everybody's using the right type, and Linda has a sense of who's monitoring them, so we can keep track of everything. That helps us to understand the effort, like even not finding them is useful information to know. We've looked over here for 5 years and nobody's ever found them. That also is interesting information.
So to wrap up, I'm going to go to full gallery so we can see everyone. What I'm going to suggest is you open up your cameras, and we'll give a big thank you to Linda, Carrina, and Laura. Well, Victoria wins the prize for visuals, obviously, right? But under your reactions button, you can put all sorts of nice things up there to show our appreciation for and to the right of there's all sorts of video. There's a frog logo. So yeah, this is now turn your microphone off, everyone. Unmute yourselves. I can't unmute you. You all unmute yourselves, everyone. Can I do that? Can I unmute everyone? Unmute myself and all say thank you. Yay! 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
And thank you, Guy, for hosting this.
Well,
and
me and
Yellow Point Ecological Society, very much appreciated.
Thanks, and thanks for sharing this with the Nanaimo Area Land Trust. Okay, folks, we're done for the evening.
Thank you.
We'll see you all soon. See you. Look after your little snakes.
Is my picture, is that an alligator lizard?
Under Victoria, it's like what's Victoria got on her?
Is that an alligator lizard? I took it in my backyard.
Identification, please, for Victoria's. Carrina's taken a close look at it. Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. Pictures are very good. I think it is, from what they said.
Okay.
All
Thanks,
right.
everyone. Bye-bye.